Yeah, hello again. I have tried to explain business models and business scenario with a larger perspective. Before we go ahead with as far as innovation and strategic perspective related to innovation, which will be more enduring in terms of the thought process assimilated from all over the world as far as thinkers and even the consumer insights or organizational insights go. But before that, one has to ponder upon that how to look at these things actually, how to look at innovation, how to look at strategic thinking and so on. And to start with, one has to deliberate upon divergent and convergent thinking. Why, I'll tell you in a moment. And then while pondering upon divergent and convergent thinking, one always has to keep innovation besides. And then automatically our thought would go towards slower and faster thinking as demonstrated by Daniel Kahneman. And then definitely we would have experienced or we experience in daily lives micro versus macro, macro versus micro. Our subjects and many of the disciplines, they focus on these two sides simultaneously and they work upon that. And then in general terms we may say this or that as a matter of choice. So before I go into the aspect of divergence and convergence, slower or faster, I should slightly ponder upon what thinking is. Thinking can be referred to with the perspective of assimilation of thoughts, rationality also, irrationality also when we think in terms of rationality, irrationality also, and analysis also, and so on. There are several larger definitions associated with thinking which are available all over. Our point of discussion is not precisely looking into the definitions of thinking or process of thinking, but thinking is related to these kind of keywords. And it's many a times it's almost imbibed in our system. It comes automatically. Many a times it is deliberate, as Daniel Kahneman suggests in Thinking Fast and Slow, wherein he tries to demonstrate that how system 1 and system 2 works as far as our thought process goes, and what are the responsibilities of both the systems and how these systems they can work in coherence, and how we can actually master these systems and utilize these systems for our own benefit. And it's a very enlarged or let's say even at micro levels also, it's a great perspective to understand. I would definitely recommend this book or the papers written by Daniel Kahneman and other authors on the subject. So now when we think in these kind of aspects, we realize that why should we deliberate upon slow and faster thinking, or let's say divergent and convergent thinking, micro and macro elements? Why should we do that? My take on this is, and then you would also agree if you will go with the literature and also according to the imbibed knowledge which you would have gained up till this stage of your careers and lives, is that most of the times we think in terms of finding out solutions. Solution finding is an important objective. But before that, I would suggest and recommend that have we mastered the art of identifying problems actually? On the lighter side, many of us would have heard at some part of life, our lives, someone saying to us that what is your problem? Many people have been asking me this question. In fact, almost all the people who have been related to me have been asking me this question, and I haven't found the answer as yet. In the childhood, parents, they ask their children most of the times, and what is your problem like? Children, they ask their parents, what is the problem like? At a particular stage, friends, they ask each other, what is your problem like? And after marriage, or when you meet someone, people do ask each other, what is your problem like? But I personally haven't been able to answer this question at all. So but I've been thinking, what is my problem like? Sometimes you feel that you yourself are a problem. So to deliberate upon this kind of thing, one finds that problem identification is more prominent, and especially when we look at innovation and business, problem identification is the key. If you have the right problem in front of you, you can find the right solution as well. And here comes the role of divergence and convergence. If you think and appropriately analyze and focus upon the central problem is that contains symptoms and causes, and you are able to coin a scenario around it, or structure a scenario around it, that this is the problem. For example, a general example wherein, for example, a product is not selling. Now, product is not selling is not the problem. There can be a distribution related problem, there can be a price related problem, there can be a product related problem itself, there can be a process related problem, there can be an expectation related problem, there can be that pre-market research or market research which should have been done to structure the sales of that product did not work appropriately because that research was not done in a precise or required fashion. More of the hunches have been incorporated with the conclusions or designing of the product. So if you identify the right problem with the right perspective, it is slightly beyond the domain of discussing how to identify the problem and the process of identification of a problem actually. But still, if problem is identified rightly, then comes in divergent and convergent thinking, or even simultaneously along with that, wherein divergence is associated with finding multiple ways of addressing things actually, and multiple solutions, one may say, if problem is there. And convergence is associated with analyzing kind of one single solution or a very precise solution if problem is already identified, and so on. So the perspective here is that one has to think in terms of looking at convergence and divergence with singularity or plurality of reaching to a problem or finding solutions of a problem actually. So that is where one has to focus upon, and that is where divergent and convergent thinking comes in. It can be as simple as that I have to reach somewhere and I have multiple choices and modes. Which mode would be best for me with respect to time or the cost which I want to spend, or my purpose of going there if I am in a hurry, and so on. So there are elements to it. So one can look at with a divergent view, and one view is converging on a single precise element or precise solution. I'll slightly focus more on this in later part of this discussion. Then comes in simultaneously, when we are thinking in terms of divergence and convergence, micro and macro comes in. You can't look at things with a microscopic perspective. You tend to do that. For example, thing is very large for you, or let's say a process, or all the aspects of a process cannot be seen simultaneously, even if it is in the physical form, or let's say a virtual form, or let's say you want to visualize the complete market scenario. You can't do it. You do it piece by piece or bit by bit. You for example, you tend to look at larger objects in a microscopic view, or let's say microscopic objects in a macroscopic view, because you want to enlarge and look at them. And this is a simultaneous kind of a process, and that happens in the, as far as thought process goes, it happens very frequently. we just elaborate or extrapolate and elaborate things simultaneously, and then we converge back and focus on one thing. For example, you want to think about your careers, you just keep on extrapolating and elaborating things that after 2 years this would happen, after 5 years this happen. And on the lighter side, usually people ask in interviews that where do you look at yourself after 5 years? I could not find any particular answer to this question, because there are so many elements which have to be silent when you are answering this kind of a question, especially in an interview. But when on the lighter side you are discussing with one of your friends that where do you look at yourself after 5 years from now, there can be a very large answer. So microscopic and macroscopic, economics also behave like that. Understanding of economics, discipline of economics, it look at micro view of economics and macro view of economics, and so on. So everywhere it exists, actually, micro and macro thinking. And when we talk of business decisions or decision making at large, but I would focus largely on business decisions. When we talk of business decisions, so generally we have this or that. And did I mention accordion or pendulum last time? It happens almost automatically. The art is that if we can manage that transition which happens with organizations or with us. So that is where our focus should be, managing that blow in, blow out process, or the transition of blow in, blow out precisely. And when pendulum is moving, then managing that transition or managing the time within that transition, that we'll try to look upon. So now comes in thinking and innovation. You see, innovation, whether incremental largely it is so, or radically oriented, is affected by divergence and convergence. There are so many elements which we have to cater to. When we talk of, let's say, market innovation, for example, I'll start from there, and then I'll come to process and product innovation, and similarly, at large with business innovation. So, for example, we are talking of innovation in terms of marketing. Now, you want to have newer ways of getting associated with the customer, or let's say you want to associate larger number of customers with similar set of products which you have, but in a different mode. For example, a tire company says that they would be charging you as per your usage, which couple of tire companies are doing. For example, insurance companies, they say that they would be charging premium on the basis of how well you maintain your health, and they will be in touch with you in real time, so that they can communicate with you as far as your health maintenance plan or procedure is going on. So that is where how you want to actually innovate upon this marketing process. There can be a pre aspect to it as well, that how do you want to get in touch with your customer, as far as how innovative you can be at that part of your marketing process. For example, you want to address your customer, or let's say you have conventionally been addressing your customer through conventional modes of advertising and integrated marketing communication, and now you want to be more innovative. So you go for some innovative process there. Online procedures are no more in category of being innovative. They were innovative earlier, so that was an incremental change in integrated marketing communication perspective. But then there can be, as I remember someone told me, that if you have a musical instrument wherein you feed the name of your company and just play it, and it has a sound wave with it which flows from one end to the other end of the earth, that would be the most innovative solution. So you have to find out that how innovative you can be, which part of newspaper you want to use, which part of television, or which point of time you want to use for television, how how you can reach to the customers physically. For example, I remember a company advertising during Kumbh Mela. Earlier, people were not focusing on Kumbh Mela as a congregation to be utilized for addressing customers or prospective customers or present customers, but now people are doing that. Last Kumbh Mela which I visited, wherein companies were addressing people with different kinds of messages. For example, someone said that Dettol advertised about that Kumbh Snan or Kumbh bath is periodical, and Dettol Snan or Dettol bath can be frequent. And then there are kiosks, or let's say ATMs by several banks which are serving people, and as well as advertising. If I remember correctly, Tata Tea distributed free tea to many people, and then there were organizations who were providing slippers and shoes at a minimal cost or free of charge, so that they can advertise their brand and products, and several others who were trying to address those people. So Kumbh is a large congregation where people from all walks of life, definitely belonging to a particular religion, but definitely in very, very large number they come. So it is an opportunity to address future buyers as well. And you see, it is definitely representing an innovation as far as addressing this market goes. And when in the next stage of after you have initially communicated with your target market, how innovative you can be as far as other elements of marketing goes, how innovative you can be as far as product, how innovative you can be as far as pricing goes, how innovative you can be as far as distribution goes, for example. So for example, many cement companies, they have been guiding their future customers or customers how to utilize cement rationally, how to construct their houses rationally, how to maintain their houses rationally, and so on. And many other companies, they have been coming along as far as giving product replacements when they feel that this product would be worn out. They are there with the next generation product to be replaced by the old generation, and without any hassles to the customer, or without any much premium, extra premium on the product. Buyback offers are there, and so on. So for example, Eureka Forbes is continuously monitoring the usage of their products, and they do monitor that what other products of Eureka Forbes you are utilizing and why, and how well they can service all the products jointly and universally, and so on. So that is where innovation as far as marketing perspective goes. There can be a radical element to it, there can be an incremental element to it. Now comes in product and process. So there have been elemental changes or vast changes as far as process and the production of several products goes. Robotics has been introduced, 3D has been introduced, 4D printing has also been introduced now, and several other processes have come. So there has been an incremental, or there has been a radical change as far as the complete entire scenario and the process goes. For example, medical sciences, the equipment, the kind of surgery, the kind of pharmaceutical discoveries, or let's say drug discoveries and molecule discoveries, and that has been radical as far as its approach goes. Now, how is divergence and convergence thinking associated with incremental or radical association is, as I said, that once you are approaching a said population, target population, with a product or a process, or you are trying to conceive any of these, you think in terms of what kind of problem this product or process would address. Now, when you are trying to focus upon the perceivable problem, and once the divergence and convergence thinking peeps in or creeps in, and then you have multiple elements to it, or singular elements to as far as identification or crystallization of a problem goes, and simultaneously you are thinking in terms of product or service as well. And once you go ahead with the situation after post problem scenario, you are trying to find out solutions to that particular problem in terms of focusing upon the features of the product, or other elements of the product or process or service. Then you definitely have divergence and convergence, keeping in either you want to be very focused and straight and one solution, one product, one solution to one problem, or one product, multiple solutions to one problem, and so on. So for example, mobile phone. Mobile phone was fundamentally associated with giving mobility to as far as our communication with each other goes, and the objective was that everyone should have a personalized phone, and the person can talk as per will and as per choice, and person can be conducted as per will, as per choice. But then music also came into being, and other elements of being always connected came in, and other features they started coming in, and today mobile phone is a complete unit of communication, entertainment, information, and so on. So now it's a gamut of features which are associated with mobile phones. So therein again comes in divergence and convergence thinking, and as far as providing products and solutions they go. So computers have also reached to that kind of a situation, and now if you analyze some of the important sectors with this perspective, you would realize that energy sector, for example, as we all understand, there is a crisis of energy. As far as on one side it's a crisis of energy, we require lots and lots of energy, and on the other side we want to raise the level of per capita energy consumption as well. So we are trying to find multiple ways of addressing this kind of a situation, and then conventional energy measures are always there, and generation is always there, and non-conventional energy generation has come with a very large kind of presence, wherein solar, wind, and other modes have emerged and evolved. And if you would refer to Earth, the sequel, it's an important book and account of organizations who are working in the field of energy generation with different perspectives, wherein someone is printing solar cells now, and someone is working on up and down motion of the sea waves for generating energy, someone is working with sugar and yeast to generate energy, and someone is working on other modes, and so on. And these experiments are now a commercial reality, as this account suggests. And it's very interesting to understand that the future of energy generation is continuously changing, and it's an exciting log. So energy is one sector which is being catered to with lots of divergence and convergence as far as the requirement of various people go. There are several organizations which are working with rice husk as the mode of energy generation, and similarly we look at waste management, for example. Now it's a huge area to be addressed with so much of divergence, and for example, if we talk in terms of cleaning the rivers, if you look at Ganges as a project which government of India is very keen to address, and they have been trying very hard. IITs have been involved at a very large level as far as this project goes. So many types of solutions with so many perspectives have been provided to only one problem: how to clean Ganges and how to manage that situation once we are able to clean it, actually. And then there are socio-cultural elements related to that. There are hydro projects which are associated with this river, which are related to that. There is a waste disposal system which has to be addressed, and it's a huge and big problem. Industrial waste system has to be generated, and then there are multiple aspects which have to be managed. So one river, we require so much of concentration. Look at the other waste management aspects which we have to cater to. For example, we are generating hardware waste on the other side, we are generating plastic waste on the other side, we are generating industrial waste on the other side, we are generating iron junk on the other side. Now this is a complete gamut which has to be addressed, and in an industrial fashion, or let's say in a large business fashion, it has to be addressed, because we have to now find economic solution wherein so many people can be associated on some business basis basically, and people are doing that. We have several examples on that. So, but again the point is, here also comes divergence and convergence. Health. There are 2 or 3 larger views on you maintain your health, or let's say post ailment scenario. Then after post ailment scenario, or once a person is ill, there are several ways to address that illness. There are surgical procedures, there are non-surgical procedures, and there are several modes of medicine also. There is allopathy, there is Ayurvedic medicine, there is homeopathy medicine, and there are several procedures. There are allopathic drugs, Ayurvedic medicines, and so on. So there are procedures. And there are modes and ways to address one single. Just to quote a scenario, for example, in rheumatoid arthritis, there are allopathy solutions as well as Ayurvedic solutions. I have personally seen patients getting well through both of the solutions. So you see, the point is how to address that, and when to utilize a particular kind of a solution for one kind of a problem. Then health provision itself is a big area basically. There is a huge gap of doctors between number of doctors and large number of patients. There is a huge gap as far as bed and patient ratio, and so on. So there is a shortage. There is a huge shortage, and then there is money which is required for as far as addressing ailments which many patients do not have. Out of pocket expenses are very high, which patients can't bear. So what to do? How to bring a solution to healthcare provision? Can there be one solution, or can there be an integrated model? Can there be a larger, several part basis or piece basis solutions which can be utilized for this? Then comes in education. How to address primary education? How to address college education? And how to bring in all the students under the domain of education? How to fulfill the short supply of teachers, and how to conduct larger research, how to involve larger number of people in research so that they can further that research for the usage of students and also the benefit of the society and country. So information technology area has multiple aspects to be catered to. Consumer goods also has transportation, which mode of transportation or how many modes of transportation. So all these are elements which go through divergence and convergence, and we see after a particular stage of time, after a particular state wherein sometimes many solutions are there, sometimes one single solution is there, and that is when we realize that divergence and convergence has occurred. But what happens between divergence and convergence? What actually is the scenario? Because you see, when divergence and convergence is taking place, actually when solutions are emerging and evolving, when multiple solutions are to come, and convergence when singular solution has to evolve, what is happening between? So there is a transition stage which is very interesting to note, and it's a very testing kind of a stage. It's a difficult stage, though it brings hope, but it incurs a lot of costs, because experimentation is going on and success and failure is simultaneous as far as until unless one of those establishes itself. So here one has to establish that innovation, though is related with micro and macro thinking, divergence and convergence thinking, can be incremental or can be radical, but fundamentally the transition within that process, transition of that process is always difficult, and it incurs costs. So, and one more element is that change management comes in due course of time, because human resource and humans as providers as well as consumers or customers are involved. So change management automatically comes in, because they have to cope up with the change, they have to manage the transition, they have to manage the time, they have to manage the situation. But whether change is managed or is passed through, or the change manages people, is always a question. So one has to see that who manages whom is an important aspect. Sometimes people feel that they just pass through times and change comes by itself and establishes itself, and sometimes people say that change can be managed and so on. But do they mean that change is to be adopted with, or one can actually manage the change, is a point to be discussed and deliberated upon. So that is where I end this session. Thank you.